I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the thing I keep coming back to, even now. Not the way people say it when they mean fate, or destiny, or whatever word they reach for when they want a story to mean something larger than it actually is. I mean it in the most practical, unglamorous sense possible. I was not on the schedule. My name was not on any list. I was at home on a Thursday evening eating leftover pasta and watching something I've already forgotten when my phone rang and Tommy Briggs, who I'd covered for twice before and who owed me in the way that people owe each other when the currency is inconvenience, told me he'd broken his arm at a recreational hockey game and that the Meridian Grand needed a replacement by 7 the next morning. I said yes because the rent was due in 11 days and because saying no to Tommy felt, in that particular moment, like a level of principle I hadn't earned yet. So that's how I ended up at the Meridian Grand. The hotel itself was the kind of place that had been designed to make you feel, the moment you walked through its doors, that whatever you'd been doing with your life up to that point had been a rough draft. The lobby had ceilings that went up farther than lobbies needed to, and lighting that came from somewhere indirect and warm and made everyone look like they were being photographed for something. The carpets were thick enough to absorb sound and pretension in equal measure. I'd worked there twice before, both times for corporate events where the primary emotional register was cautious optimism and the dress code was business formal. I knew where the service entrance was. I knew which elevator to take. I knew not to make eye contact with guests in the corridor unless they made it first, which they rarely did. The ballroom was on the 3rd floor, and they were still setting up when I arrived. I remember the microphone situation because Becky Shaw, the event coordinator, a compact woman with a headset and the energy of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and professional obligation, pulled me aside within 10 minutes of my arrival and pointed to the stage where 2 technicians were crouched over an equipment case with the focused expressions of people solving a problem they hadn't anticipated. "Main mic died overnight," she said, not really to me, more to the room in general. "We're replacing it. Should be fine." Then she looked at me the way people looked at substitute staff, assessing whether I was the kind of problem that would compound or the kind that would simply stay quiet and carry things. Apparently I passed, because she handed me a printed floor plan and moved on. They installed the replacement unit 40 minutes before the first guests arrived. I didn't think anything of it. Nobody did. It was a microphone. It worked. The sound check came back clean. What none of us understood, what I wouldn't understand until much later, standing 8 feet from the head table with a tray in my hands and a sentence still echoing in the air, was that the replacement unit was newer than the original. More sensitive. Calibrated for a larger room than the one we were in. And the Meridian Grand Ballroom, with its vaulted ceiling and its particular arrangement of hard surfaces and soft furnishings, had acoustics that were already exceptional. The original microphone had been chosen with that in mind. The replacement had not been chosen at all. It had simply been available. The result was a room that could carry a whisper to the far wall and return it intact. The guests arrived at 6. I circulated with the pre-reception drinks and did what I was good at, which was being present without being noticed. I read the room the way you learn to read rooms in this work, not for what people were saying, but for what they were about to need. A glass held at a certain angle. A pause in conversation that meant someone was ready to move. The specific way a person looked toward the bar without quite committing to going there. I saw Savannah Walsh for the first time when she entered with her family. I didn't know her name then. I knew she was someone important because of the way the room reorganized slightly when she walked in, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just that small unconscious shift of attention that happened when someone arrived who mattered to the people already present. She was in ivory. Not white, something warmer, with more depth to it. She moved through the room the way certain people moved, like she'd already accounted for the space and had decided it was adequate. I refilled a glass near the entrance, and then moved on. I did not know that in approximately 3 hours, a microphone no one had chosen on purpose would carry her voice across a room that had no business being that quiet, and that I would be standing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Or maybe, as I've thought about it since, exactly the right one. The toast started at 7:30. I had been on my feet for 4 hours by then, and had developed the particular kind of tired that wasn't exhaustion so much as a settling, the body accepting its assignment and getting on with it. I knew the room by that point. I knew which tables drank faster, and which ones were still on their first glass. I knew that the man at table 4 had a habit of holding his empty glass at chest height as a passive signal, and that the woman at table 11 would smile and wave me off even when her glass was nearly empty, and that I should refill it anyway on the next pass because by the third time she waved me off she actually meant it. This was the work. Not glamorous, not complicated, but it required a kind of attention that most people didn't recognize as skill because it looked, from the outside, like simply walking around a room. The speeches were the kind that happened at weddings like this one. Measured, warm, carefully constructed to sound spontaneous. Preston Hawley's best man, a tall guy with good hair and the confidence of someone who had rehearsed in front of a mirror and knew it had gone well, talked about loyalty and partnership and the particular honor of watching two people find each other. The usual architecture. The usual materials. I'd heard versions of it at every formal event I'd worked, assembled in slightly different configurations, and it always landed the same way, which was well enough, because the people in the room wanted it to land well and were prepared to help it along. I was on my 4th circuit of the perimeter when the last toast concluded. The applause followed. Genuine enough, sustained enough. And then it ended, the way applause always ended, with that brief collective exhale where the room released the performance and settled back into itself. The band, which had been holding at low ambient volume during the speeches, hadn't yet picked back up. Someone near the bar laughed at something and then the laugh finished and there was a moment, maybe 4 seconds, maybe 5, where the Meridian Grand Ballroom was as quiet as a room with 230 people in it could reasonably be. That was the moment. I was passing within 8 feet of the head table on my way back toward the service corridor. I wasn't looking at the head table. I was looking at the tray in my hands and calculating whether I needed to exchange it before the next circuit or could manage another pass. I was thinking about the man at table 4 and his passive glass signal. I was not thinking about anything that mattered, which is usually how it goes in the moments before something changes. Savannah Walsh was leaning slightly toward her mother. I know this because I registered the movement in my peripheral vision the way you registered motion when you'd spent enough time reading a room, not consciously, not with intention, just the low-level awareness that something nearby had shifted. She was speaking quietly. The kind of quietly that meant the words were for one person and not the room. The microphone on the stage was off by then. It didn't matter. The room did the rest. She said, "I'm not going to marry Preston. I've been in love with someone else for 3 years. I think you've always known that. I think I've always known it too. I'm sorry that tonight was when I finally said it out loud. I heard every word. Not because I was listening. Not because I was positioned strategically or paying any particular attention to the head table. I heard every word because the replaced microphone had done something to the room's acoustic character that nobody had accounted for, and because the applause had ended at exactly the wrong moment, and because Savannah Walsh had chosen, or not chosen, had simply arrived at, this precise pause in the evening to say what she had been carrying for 3 years. The silence that followed arrived the way Becky Shaw had once described a certain kind of event crisis to me during a slow prep hour, not all at once, but in sequence. First the people closest to the source, who had the information and processed it immediately, and went very still. Then the next ring out, who caught the stillness from their neighbors the way you caught a sharp intake of breath from someone standing next to you, involuntarily, by proximity, before you even knew what had caused it. Then the outer tables, where people looked up from their conversations not because they had heard the words but because the quality of the room had changed and something older than conscious thought was telling them that the air was different now. I did not move. This was partly training. Staff didn't react to things. Staff existed in a separate register from the event, present and functional and categorically uninvolved in whatever the event produced emotionally. I had been told this in the agency orientation and had learned it practically over 2 years of working rooms like this one, and it had never been difficult before because nothing had ever required it of me the way this did. But it was also something simpler than training. It was that Savannah Walsh, in the middle of whatever was now happening at the head table, had turned. Not toward the room in general. Not in the unfocused way of someone whose gaze had drifted during a difficult moment. She turned with the same quality of movement I had noticed when she'd entered the ballroom 3 hours earlier, that settled, already decided quality, and she looked directly at me. Not in my direction. At me. There was a specificity to it that made the distinction impossible to argue with. I was 8 feet from the head table and there was no one between us, and the wall behind me was not what she was looking at. I know because I checked. I looked behind me at the wall. The wall was cream-colored and unadorned and was not looking at anyone. I looked back at Savannah. She held my gaze for a moment that I could not have measured accurately if I'd tried, and then returned to her mother, and the conversation at the head table resumed in the compressed urgent register of people who had a great deal to say and had just become aware that they were being watched saying it. Preston Hawley sat to her left with his hands flat on the table. He hadn't moved. He had the specific stillness of a man performing composure in real time, and performing it well, which made the whole thing considerably harder to witness than if he hadn't. I stood with my tray. Somewhere at the back of my mind, with the detached clarity that arrived sometimes in the middle of things that were too large to process directly, I noted that 2 of the glasses on my tray needed replacing and that this was a thing I was technically capable of doing and that the service corridor was approximately 30 feet away and that walking toward it was a legitimate and purposeful action available to me. I walked toward it. I don't think I breathed until I got there. Becky Shaw found me in the service corridor before I'd made it 10 feet past the door. I don't know how she moved that fast. I don't know where she had been standing or how much she had seen or whether she had heard the same words I'd heard, but she appeared beside me with the momentum of someone who had been walking very quickly and had made a decision somewhere in transit to call it composure. She was looking at her tablet. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at her tablet again in the way people looked at things when they needed a brief intermediary step before saying what they had to say. "How close were you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I was doing a perimeter pass." "How close?" 8 feet, maybe." She closed her eyes for approximately 2 seconds. I had worked 3 events under Becky Shaw and I had never seen her close her eyes before. It was a small thing, but it recalibrated my understanding of the situation considerably. "Okay," she said, opening them. "Here's what's happening. There are people, the right kind of people, the kind whose entire professional function is managing moments like this one, who have already been contacted and are already managing. You don't need to know more than that. What you need to know is that the reception continues." "The reception continues," I said. "The reception continues," she repeated, with the conviction of someone who had attended enough crisis management seminars to believe that saying a thing with sufficient authority made it structurally true. "The guests need attending to. The bar needs monitoring. Table 7 has been on the same bottle of white for 40 minutes, which means they either stopped drinking or they're pacing themselves for something, and either way I want eyes on it. You are going to go back out there, and you are going to do your job, and you are going to do it well, which I have every confidence you're capable of, and you are not going to make eye contact with anyone at the head table." I said. She looked at me. Becky's tablet made a sound. She looked at it. Something moved across her face, not alarm exactly, but its more professional cousin, and then she replaced it with the neutral expression of someone being paid to have a neutral face. "I know," she said. "Why did she?" "Dylan." She said my name the way people said names when they wanted to replace a sentence with a single word. "Go back out there." I went back out there. The room had reorganized. Not visibly, not in any way that someone arriving fresh would have noticed. The tables were where they'd been. The centerpieces were where they'd been. The band had resumed, something ambient and middle distance. the kind of music designed to give a room permission to exist without performing its enjoyment of itself. But the conversations were different. Tighter. Lower. People were leaning in more than they had been 20 minutes ago, and the laughter, when it came, arrived half a beat late, that specific delay of someone checking the room before committing to a response. I moved through it with the economy I'd developed over 2 years of this work and tried to locate the frequency I was supposed to be occupying, which was present and functional and categorically elsewhere. It was harder than usual. Preston Hawley was still at the head table. This was the thing I hadn't expected. I don't know what I'd expected, that he would leave, maybe, or that someone from his family would have guided him to a quieter room where the architecture of the evening could be managed without an audience. But he was still there, sitting with the upright stillness of a man who had made a decision about the kind of person he was going to be tonight, and was in the process of keeping it. His family had arranged themselves around him in the unconscious geometry of people providing structural support, while maintaining the appearance of simply sitting nearby. The man I'd identified as his closest friend, or possibly his brother, the resemblance was significant, was on his left and talking steadily in a low voice, the specific activity of someone who understood that the important thing right now was to keep a person connected to words. I gave the head table a wide berth and worked the outer tables. At table 7, the bottle situation resolved itself. They'd been pacing for a toast they were planning among themselves, something informal and slightly sentimental, and by the time I passed they were already mid-pour and didn't need me. At table 12, an older man stopped me to ask whether the salmon had been wild-caught or farmed, which I knew because Becky required us to memorize the sourcing on everything, a requirement I had found excessive when she'd outlined it during the pre-event briefing and found genuinely useful approximately once per event. Wild-caught, I told him. Pacific Northwest. He nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicion had been confirmed and returned to his conversation. I moved on. At table 9, 2 women were speaking in the low rapid register of people processing something significant, and they paused when I approached and resumed when I moved away, which was normal. At table 14, a young couple was absorbed in each other in the way that young couples at weddings sometimes became absorbed in each other, the event around them functioning as a kind of backdrop rather than a thing they were actually attending. They didn't notice me at all. I refilled their water glasses and left. And then there was table 13. I had been avoiding it, I realized, without having made a conscious decision to do so. It was in the far left quadrant of the room, partially shielded from the head table by a floral arrangement that the designer had probably not intended as a privacy screen but which functioned as one adequately. I had passed it twice already and both times found a reason to redirect. The woman sitting alone there was somewhere in her late 70s. Glasses on a gold chain. A glass of bourbon that she was drinking with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had long since stopped needing alcohol to do anything other than accompany the evening. She was watching the room with the particular quality of attention that belonged to people who had seen enough occasions to find the current one interesting rather than alarming. When I came close enough to check her water glass, she looked up at me. "You're the one she looked at," she said. Not a question. Stated with the flat certainty of someone reporting a fact they had personally verified. "I was near the head table," I said. "Occupational positioning." She considered this with the patience of someone who had stopped being satisfied by occupational positioning as an explanation for anything. "My granddaughter," she said, "has never looked at anything accidentally in her life. Not once. Not when she was 4 years old and she spilled an entire glass of apple juice directly onto our family attorney during a Sunday dinner, which everyone called an accident, and which I knew then and know now was nothing of the sort." She picked up her bourbon. "I'm Dorothy Walsh. I imagine you've worked out already who that makes me." I had. I stood with my tray and did the arithmetic of what a person said to a senator's mother at a reception that had gone the way this one had gone. I came up with very little. "I'm just a waiter," I said. Dorothy Walsh looked at me over the rim of her glass with the expression of someone who had heard a considerable number of things in her life, and was making a quiet private assessment of where this particular sentence ranked among them. Yes, she said, with a serenity that somehow managed to imply its opposite. I imagine that's exactly what makes it interesting. She returned to her bourbon. I refilled her water glass, which she hadn't touched, and moved on. The summons came through Becky, which was the correct channel, and it was phrased as a request, which was the correct phrasing, and it arrived with the quiet understanding that it was either of those things, which was the correct understanding. I was in the service corridor again. I had been spending a significant portion of the evening in the service corridor, which had become a kind of neutral territory, a place where the event existed at one remove, where I could set down a tray and stand still for 30 seconds without the standing still meaning anything to anyone. I had been out on the floor for 40 minutes since my conversation with Dorothy Walsh and had managed, with moderate success, to return to the frequency Becky had prescribed. Present. Functional. Categorically elsewhere. Then Becky came through the corridor door with her tablet and her headset and the expression of someone who had been given a piece of information and had decided, as a professional matter, not to have feelings about it. She's asking for you, Becky said. I set down the tray I was holding. Specifically you, Becky continued, because apparently my expression had suggested I might be entertaining alternative interpretations. She used your name. Which means someone told her your name at some point during this evening, which means… She stopped. She looked at her tablet. She looked back at me. Which means this has been a thing that was going to happen for longer than the last hour and a half, and I want you to know that I find that professionally unsettling, and I am setting it aside. Where? Room 114. It's off the east corridor, past the coat check. Small sitting room, used for family consultations during large events. There will be no one else in there. A pause. I'll be outside. Becky. Dylan. The name again, doing the work of a longer sentence. She asked. You go. That's the shape of the evening now. Room 114 was the kind of room that existed in hotels like the Meridian Grand for the purpose of giving important people somewhere to be that wasn't the main event. It had 2 chairs, a low table with a glass pitcher of water on it, and a window that looked out onto the interior courtyard where small accent lights were arranged among the hedges in a way that was tasteful and impersonal and had clearly been designed by someone who understood that the room's function required a view that was pleasant without being distracting. Savannah Walsh was already there. She was standing at the window with a glass of water, plain water, not one of the champagne flutes from the reception, and she turned when I came in with the unhurried quality that I was beginning to understand was simply how she moved through the world. Not performance. Not composure under pressure. Just the natural register of a person who had long since made her peace with occupying space. I stopped at a distance that felt professionally appropriate, and then realized I was still holding my tray. The tray was empty. There was no legitimate reason to be holding an empty tray in a private sitting room, and I knew this and couldn't immediately think of what else to do with my hands, so I looked for somewhere to set it, and found a narrow shelf near the door and placed it there with what I hoped passed for a natural motion. It did not pass for a natural motion. Savannah watched this without comment. Dylan, she said. She said my name with the same precision I had noticed in Dorothy's speech, each syllable given its full value, nothing swallowed. Ms. Walsh, I said, because the agency briefing on formal address had covered exactly this situation, or near enough to it, and it was the one piece of professional ground I felt I was standing on firmly. Sit down, she said, and took the chair nearest the window, which left me the one closer to the door, and I sat in it with the careful posture of a man who was not entirely sure which version of himself belonged in this room. She looked at me for a moment with the quality of attention I had first noticed when she'd entered the ballroom. Not intrusive. Not searching in the anxious way of someone who needed something confirmed. Simply thorough, in the way of someone who had learned that looking at things carefully was worthwhile because things had consequences. You heard what I said, she said. Not a question. The acoustics in that room, I said, are exceptional. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The idea of one, maybe. My grandmother had this hotel's ballroom renovated in 2019, she said. She told the acoustical engineer that a room that swallowed sound was a room that kept secrets, and that she had strong feelings about secrets. I thought about Dorothy Walsh at table 13 with her bourbon and her gold-chain glasses and her flat certainty that her granddaughter had never done anything accidentally. I met her, I said. Earlier. Table 13. I know. Savannah looked at her water glass. She told me. She also told me what you said to her. I told her I was just the waiter. Yes. She looked up. She found that very interesting. She mentioned that. A pause settled between us. Outside the window, the courtyard lights held their arrangement among the hedges, steady and impersonal. Somewhere down the east corridor I was aware, in an abstract way, of Becky Shaw standing outside the door with her tablet and her headset and her professional neutrality. I want to explain something, Savannah said. Not because you're owed an explanation. You're not. You were standing in a room when something happened, and that isn't a debt I've incurred toward you. She said it without coldness, simply as a fact being accurately stated. But you were standing there, and my grandmother has apparently already introduced herself, which means you're further into this evening than a waiter at table position 8 should reasonably be. 6, I said. She looked at me. Table position 6, I said. I was on the inner perimeter, not the outer. The positions are numbered from the head table outward. She held my gaze for a moment. 6, she said, with the seriousness of someone making a genuine correction to the record. Then you're further into this evening than a waiter at table position 6 should be. And I find incomplete information untidy. So I'm going to tell you something, and then you're going to go back out and finish your shift, and what you do with it after that is entirely your own matter. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have improved the moment. She set down her water glass and looked at me with the expression of someone who had been carrying a decision for a long time and had, sometime in the last 2 hours, set it down. What I said tonight was not impulsive, she said. I understand how it appeared. I understand what it did to the room and what it did to Preston, who is a good man and who deserved considerably better timing, and I have thought about that and will continue to think about it. But it was not impulsive. It was the end of a very long process of thinking, and it arrived tonight because… She paused. Because some moments don't wait for the convenient ones. I sat with that. You don't have to explain this to me, I said. I'm the waiter. You said that to my grandmother? She said, and she repeated it to me within 4 minutes, which should tell you something about how she moves when she finds something worth repeating. She picked up her water glass again. Looked at it. I told you I find incomplete information untidy, she said. That's true. But that's not the only reason I asked you here. She looked at me then with the directness that I had been on the receiving end of twice now and had not yet learned to meet without something shifting in my chest. You were the only person in that room, she said quietly, who wasn't performing a reaction. I didn't know what to say to that. Not because the sentence was unclear. It was one of the clearest things anyone had said to me in a long time. I didn't know what to say because it was the kind of observation that arrived from outside yourself and landed somewhere internal, in a place you hadn't known was available for landing, and the honest response to that wasn't a sentence. It was a silence that needed a moment to settle before anything else could follow it. So I let it settle. Outside the window the courtyard lights held their arrangement. Down the corridor the reception continued in its reorganized form, quieter than it had begun, more honest in the way that late evenings were always more honest than early ones. I was aware of all of this at a slight remove, the way you were aware of weather through a window. Everyone else was doing something, Savannah continued, when I didn't speak. Shock or calculation or the specific kind of sympathy that's mostly about positioning. Preston's family was managing. My family was managing. The coordinator, Becky was managing. Everyone had a function they moved into. She looked at her water glass. You were just there. Holding your tray. Present without an agenda. I had an agenda, I said. 2 of the glasses needed replacing, and I was trying to calculate whether I could make another pass or needed to go back to the corridor first. She looked at me. That's exactly what I mean, she said. And then something happened that I hadn't planned and couldn't have anticipated, which was that I laughed. Not loudly. Not with any particular comedy in it. Just a quiet, genuine thing that came out before I'd made any decision about it. The kind of laugh that arrived when something was true in a way that caught you off guard. Savannah watched it happen with the expression of someone who had been given something small and had registered its value accurately. The room was quiet for a moment after. Can I ask you something? I said. You were in a private room with me and spoke with my grandmother in the same evening, she said. I think questions are within scope. 3 years? I said. You said you'd been in love with someone for 3 years. And you said it tonight, at this specific occasion, in that specific room. I stopped, and then continued because the evening had used up whatever instinct I had for leaving things unfinished. That wasn't an accident either. Was it? It was not a question. I had learned, over the course of this evening, that the women of this family responded differently to questions than to statements. Dorothy had answered my silences more honestly than she'd answered my words. And Savannah, I was beginning to understand, operated in the same register, not evasively, but with the particular patience of someone who gave things their actual weight before responding. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It wasn't. She stood and moved to the window, not away from the conversation but simply changing her relationship to the room, the way people sometimes needed to be standing to say certain things. 3 years ago, she said, I was here. In this hotel. Not for an event. I was coming from a meeting with my father that had gone the way meetings with my father sometimes go, which is to say that it had covered a great deal of ground efficiently and left very little room for anything that couldn't be quantified. She paused. I was walking through the lobby. I wasn't in a good state. I wasn't performing anything because there was no one watching who mattered, and I was tired of performing in rooms where it didn't count. I was very still. There was a man near the lobby's east corridor, she said. He was in a hotel uniform, so he was staff, and he was holding a flower. A single stem, cream-colored, slightly damaged, the kind of thing that comes loose from a centerpiece arrangement when someone handles it without enough care. He wasn't doing anything with it. He wasn't on his way somewhere. He was just standing there, completely alone in a corridor that had no foot traffic, holding this slightly damaged flower and smelling it. With this expression, she stopped. She turned from the window and looked at me. Like he'd found something worth finding, she said. In a broken flower in an empty corridor. Like that was enough. I knew, before she said anything else, what was coming. There was a particular quality to the silence that preceded it, the kind of silence that had weight and direction. That was you, she said. It wasn't a question. I thought back. 3 years. This hotel. An evening in March, I thought, though I couldn't be certain of the month. A corporate dinner on the 2nd floor, a long setup, a centerpiece that had shed one of its stems when the florist's assistant had bumped the cart in the service corridor. I had picked it up off the floor because leaving it there had seemed wrong somehow, and I had carried it for a while without deciding what to do with it, and at some point in the east corridor I had stopped and done the thing she was describing, which I remembered now as a moment of simple and complete nothing, no agenda, no performance, just a flower and a corridor and 30 seconds of not being anywhere in particular. I had not seen her. I didn't see you, I said. I know, she said. That was part of it. She came back to her chair and sat down, not with the ceremony of someone concluding something but with the ease of someone who had said what needed saying and was now simply in the room. Preston never did anything like that, she said. Not because he was incapable of it. He's a good man, genuinely. But his relationship to the world is different. Everything has a purpose. Everything is in motion towards something. There's no room in it for standing in an empty corridor with a broken flower for no reason at all. She looked at me steadily. I didn't know your name. I didn't know anything about you. But I thought about that moment for 3 years and I could never explain it away, which is the thing that finally told me what it meant. I sat with that for a long time. The water pitcher on the low table between us caught the light from the window and held it in a long pale stripe across the tablecloth. I looked at it. I looked at her. You said tonight wasn't impulsive, I said finally. That it was the end of a long process of thinking. Yes. And the process started in a corridor with a flower. The process started with understanding what I was missing, she said. The corridor was just when I first understood what that looked like. Outside, somewhere down the east corridor, I heard the faint sound of the band shifting into something slower. The last hour of the reception finding its register, the way last hours always did. I thought about Becky outside the door with her tablet, counting minutes. I should go back out, I said. I know, she said. I stood. Picked up the empty tray from the shelf by the door, because it was mine and because leaving it felt wrong. Stood for a moment at the threshold of the room with no particularly good reason to still be standing there. That flower, I said. I left it on the windowsill in the east corridor. I didn't know what else to do with it. Savannah looked at me from her chair with the small, honest smile I had seen once before, the smile of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had recently set it down. I know, she said quietly. I went back for it. I stood in the doorway for one more second. Then I went back out. The last hour of a reception was its own kind of event. I had learned this over 2 years of working rooms like this one. The way the final hour had a different texture than everything preceding it, looser, more honest, the performance layer thinning as people grew tired of maintaining it. Guests who had been formerly gracious became simply pleasant. Conversations that had been conducted at the level of occasion descended to the level of people. It was, I had decided, the best hour of any event, and the one nobody planned for, because the people who planned events were always thinking about beginnings. I moved through the thinning crowd and did my work and tried not to think too hard about the room off the east corridor, and the woman in it, and the things she had told me about a broken flower on a windowsill. I mostly failed at the not thinking part. Preston Hawley had moved from the head table to a smaller one near the window, where he was sitting with 2 people his own age who were clearly friends rather than family. The conversation there had taken on the quality of people being honest with each other in the way that was only possible after a certain number of hours and a certain quantity of something stronger than champagne. He laughed once, genuinely, at something one of them said, and I felt something release in the room that I hadn't realized was still held. I was collecting the last of the glasses, most of them dim and finished, when I became aware that Savannah had come back into the hall. She had changed from the ivory of the ceremony into something simpler. Still formal, but differently so. She moved through the remaining guests with the same quality she always moved with, except that something about it was lighter than it had been at the start of the evening. Less weight in it. The weight was still there. I didn't imagine it had gone anywhere, but she was carrying it differently now. I watched her stop at table 13. Dorothy was back, having reappeared with the sourceless quality of someone who had never truly left. The 2 of them spoke briefly with the ease of people who had been talking to each other for a long time and had developed a private efficiency about it. Dorothy said something. Savannah glanced across the room and found me immediately, with the directness I had stopped trying to account for, and I looked back at her and did not look away. She crossed the room. "You're still here," she said. "Until the last glass is cleared," I said. "Agency policy." "Is that the actual policy or a thing you say?" "Both," I said. "It's the actual policy and I find it useful." She stood beside me and looked at the room. At the spent centerpiece blooms open and finished. At Preston near the window, laughing again. At the band playing something slow and closing, the musical equivalent of a door being gently shut. "He'll be all right," I said. "I know," she said. "Preston is fundamentally well constructed." A pause. "It's one of the things I genuinely like about him. It's also one of the reasons we would have been comfortable together rather than anything better than comfortable. And I think we both knew it. She said it without drama, without apology, with the clarity of someone who had examined something honestly and was simply reporting the result. We stood there for a moment, side by side, not quite looking at each other, watching the room finish itself. Then she said, "Do you apply for your postings or are they assigned?" "Depends," I said. "Both sometimes." She nodded once, with the quality of someone filing information away carefully. Then she moved on, back to her family, back to whatever the rest of the evening required of her. I watched her go. A minute later Dorothy passed me on her way out, unhurried, bourbon long finished, glasses catching the last of the ballroom light. She didn't stop. She didn't say anything. She simply placed a folded piece of paper on my tray with the smooth deliberateness of someone who had been planning to do exactly that for quite some time. I finished the last circuit. I helped break down the linen near the service corridor. I carried things to the collection point and went back for more, and by the time the Meridian Grand Ballroom was simply a room again, I had almost convinced myself that the piece of paper was nothing. I unfolded it in the break room. A phone number. And below it, in handwriting that was unhurried and precise. Asterisk, she remembers that day in the lobby too. And she went back for the flower. Asterisk. I stood under the break room's fluorescent light for a long time. Then I took out my phone. And I wrote the first message of my life to a person I had never officially met, a person who had watched me stand alone in an empty corridor holding a broken flower, and had found in that moment the same thing I hadn't known I was looking for. Her reply came in 40 seconds. It said, asterisk, I was wondering how long you'd stand there. Asterisk. I laughed. Quietly, in an empty break room, at the end of the strangest evening of my life. And then I wrote back.